today's project, we're going to be making this stuffed winter bear. And this is a project I chose specifically for the Cameo Pro, just because I thought it would be fun to make it really big. So this is just a design. It's called Polar Bear. It's a design by Silhouette, and the design ID number was in the class registration supply list. But this is just a two-dimensional design that you could cut out of, paper or vinyl or whatever normally. But I chose to make it really big so we can cut it with fabric and stuff it with a pillow. This class is going to use the Cameo Pro, as I've mentioned. We're also going to use the rotary blade, some other supplies you'll need. It was listed in the supply list, but you'll need the full 24-inch cutting mat. I've got white cotton fabric, red felt. I'm using, for the face, I'm going to be using the black fabric heat transfer, but really you could use smooth heat transfer, or you could use flocked heat transfer. Those would all be good options. I'll be using the fabric heat transfer. But I think we will go ahead. Oh, you also need an iron for the heat transfer, a heat press if you've got it, and a sewing machine, and also a needle and thread. So you'll do a little bit with the, sorry, I lost connection. You'll be doing a little bit with the sewing machine and then some with hand sewing. But let's go ahead and get started. I am going to share my screen and go into Silhouette Studio. And get my glasses so I can see what I'm doing. All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started with setting up the page setup panel. The machine we're going to choose is the Cameo Pro. The cutting mat is going to be the Cameo Pro. And the media size is going to be 24-inch by 24-inch. And that is just one of your options here in the drop down. So your screen, your mat, your virtual mat and page should look like this. So we'll go ahead and open that Polar Bear design up in the library. If you've already purchased it, you should be able to just start typing Polar Bear, and that'll come up in your library. And so I've got this design double clicked to open it, and I'm going to stretch this with a corner handle. I want this bear, oops, undo. I want to select all of it at the same time. So drag across to select all of it. I want the bear part to be 11.75 inches. So I'm just watching my numbers change. The other thing I can do is I can group it. Once I've grouped it, then I can lock up here on the scale portion of the quick access toolbar. I'm going to lock the aspect ratio, and I'll just type in for the width 11.75 and hit enter. And you can see that that's going to be almost 18 inches tall. So this is a great project for working with the Cameo Pro. Okay, so now I'm going to ungroup it. And the only thing I want on my right now is the bear outline. I'm going to select the face and group it and move it off to the side. And then I will also move all these scarf pieces off to the side. We'll get to those later. Okay, so I've got my bear outline. And because this is made for paper or vinyl and I want to sew it, I'm going to create a seam allowance. So I'm going to do that by going to my offset panel over on the side. Let's see, I'll drag that so I can see it. So I'm going to click offset, and I want it to be 0.25 inches for a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I've got that, I can close it. And now I'm going to drag the original part of the bear. I don't need that anymore. I just want this offset. And since it's going to be a pillow, I need a front and a back. So I'm going to create a duplicate and I'm going to mirror it. So I'm going to go over to Object and create an Object, Replicate, and Mirror Above. You could also find that in your Replicate panel over on the side, but that's just one quick way to do it. Okay, so now I have a mirrored copy. So it'll have a front and a back. And I want to position them both on the 24-inch mat. So you can see I've got these, try and keep it within about a ½ inch of the edge if you can. If you press your G key on your keyboard, you can turn on the grid so you can see a little ½ inch allowance if you can. Make sure those are not overlapping. So that looks good. I'm going to go over to the Send panel, the Send tab. And on this, I actually need to insert my rotary blade. So let me stop sharing for just a minute. Okay, so on the rotary blade, the first time you use it, you'll need to just screw the collar, just twist the collar. So it comes, if you can see a gap, you just need to twist it to tighten it, and that'll make sure that the rotary blade is actually exposed, and then you won't ever have to do that again. You can just leave it where it's at. And then I'm just going to insert that in my carriage too, the right-hand side. Just make sure it holds in there while you press it closed. And I will go back to sharing my screen. Okay, so we're going to cut this with carriage 2. So right now I'm going to collapse carriage 1. Oh. Turn on my machine so it actually recognizes. All right, so I'm going to let this think for just a minute. If you don't have your Cameo Pro selected, if it's showing that a little warning sign, make sure your machine is on and make sure your machine is selected. So it should say something like ready to load down here, and you can find your machine in this list down here by clicking on the little machine icon. Okay, so carriage 2 is what we're going to be working with. And right now, these shapes are red, which means that they think they're cutting with carriage 1. So I'm going to select them. And with carriage 2 highlighted, I'm going to choose rotary cut. The other thing we need to do is choose our material. So with material, on this one, I'm going to choose fabric thin cotton print. Now the action should automatically change to rotary cut because it's detecting the rotary blade. So your screen should look like mine. We're just going to use the default settings. So the line should be blue, and you should see these little hooks and loops that are extra motions that your blade takes to orient itself when it's cutting fabric, when it's cutting with the rotary blade. Okay, so this is ready to send. All right, so let me get this cleared off and we'll get my space cleared off and get ready to send this. Okay, now when you are working with the Cameo Pro, it takes a lot of space. You should know that, and you should plan for it. So it's got the 24-inch mat, and it needs to be able to have surface in front of it the whole time it's moving in and out, and the surface behind it. So it needs to have all of this clear space. You don't want it hanging off the edge of the table. That can warp the design. So let me get my fabric on the mat. And I've already cut my 12-inch or my 24-inch by 24-inch white cotton fabric. So this can cover the entire grid since it's the full 24 inches. I'm using a strong tack mat. You can use a standard tack mat, just you don't want it to be overused. You need it to be plenty sticky. So I'm going to smooth that down. Try and avoid any creasing and puckering. All right, I got that a little bit crooked. Rotate it, see if I can see it better. So really, this is one of the hardest parts of working with the Cameo Pro, is just making sure that you're just working with this giant mat. Oh, I might be okay this time. All right, this is another reason why I like to leave an extra ½ inch as I'm placing the design in the software. So if I'm off a little bit, I know I don't need to cut all the way up to the edge if my paper doesn't, or my fabric doesn't go all the way on. Okay. The other thing I like to do, especially if you're not using the strong tack mat, is just to give an extra press on with some kind of brayer. And I just use the inside of a 12-inch vinyl roll. Just press that on really well. Okay, now to load it. There's 2 load lines on the Cameo Pro, actually on the Cameo Pro for sure. So when you're using the full 24-inch mat, you want to go with the outer load line. If I can get that. Does it look lined up? All right, I'll press my load button. And I always check to make sure that as I'm looking on the back here where it's fed in, I just want to make sure that it's loaded evenly. So I've got about the same position on the cutting strip on this side as I do on that side, and then I know it's loaded straight. So this is all ready, and I'm just going to click send in the software. I'm not going to share my screen for this It's just the blue send button at the bottom. Okay, so the rotary blade is cutting, and you'll see it go up and down. It'll reposition itself. It'll do those little extra cuts that showed on the screen. And for fabric, it's going to go pretty slow. It's going to cut out both of those bears. Do we have any questions that I need to answer? Okay, then we'll just watch it cut. I should mention that the fabric I chose for this bear, you could choose really any fabric that you want, but I chose a white, kind of a quilting weight cotton with a white pattern on it. I just like that little bit of white on white. If it has some other pattern like glitter or something, you might need to increase your settings a little bit, maybe your force settings, to make sure it cuts all the way through. But this is, the preset has worked really well for me, just cutting a quilting weight cotton. You probably don't want to speed this up. You can increase your speed on the Cameo Pro up to 30. And I think this is set to a speed of, might just be speed of 1. But for something like fabric, you want to keep it at a slow speed. And really, anytime you're using the rotary blade, it should work on a fairly low speed just to make sure it gets cut all the way through. Any other questions?
All right, Kelly, we do have one question. Somebody asked, what blade should you be using for this project?
What blade should you be using for this project? Good question. The blades I'm using right now is the rotary blade for the Cameo 4. That works on all the Cameo 4 models. So the regular for the Plus and the Pro. And then I'm also using the auto blade. I'm going to cut fabric and felt with the rotary blade. And then I'm going to use the auto blade to cut heat transfer that we'll be applying as the face for the bear.
Okay, and then somebody else asked if they have an older Cameo, can they cut fabric on the older Cameos?
Okay, so an older Cameo cutting fabric, you can, but you have to use some type of fabric stabilizer. So that would be like an iron-on interfacing. There's also a product called Material Magic that you basically spray it on and iron it, and it gives some stiffness to your fabric. And I haven't used the Material Magic, but I know that lots of people use that. So you need some kind of stiffener for your fabric if you're using an older Cameo that doesn't have the rotary blade. And then you're going to use a regular blade that'll slice through it. That's why it needs to have that stiffener. This rotary blade, right now, I don't have anything on this fabric. It's just straight from the fabric store and doesn't need any stiffener. You can still stiffen it if you want to cut with the rotary blade, but you'll see that it does pretty good. You might need to snip a little bit with scissors, any little tiny bits that it misses, but really the rotary blade is really nice for fabric with all the Cameo 4 models.
Okay, we have one more question about the rotary blade. Somebody asked, how long will your blade usually last if you cut a lot of fabric?
So I have gone through one rotary blade so far, and I've had the machine for at least a couple months, but I was not cutting just fabric. I was also cutting crepe paper, and I was testing, cutting different materials like leather and things. And so if you're cutting fabric, that does not have a high wear and tear on your blade. So if you, the other thing that would prematurely wear out your rotary blade is if you were cutting at settings that are too high, too heavy. But I would say it should last you, well, I can't say for sure, but I would guess it would last you a couple months if you're cutting a lot of fabric. One other thing I can mention is that although I'm using the Cameo Pro for this class, and I've got these bears both set up on the 24-inch, the whole 24-inch mat, you could cut it with a Cameo 4, this big tall bear. I think you could probably fit, well, you'd have to cut it one side at a time, but if you use the 12 by 24-inch mat, you could cut it with a Cameo 4. That's either the standard or the plus. I think we're almost done with this cut. Okay, so I'm going to press unload, and we will get these bears cut out. Now, it's good to have scissors handy when you peel this away. It will sometimes miss just little bits. It's easy to see where it got missed and just trim it with your scissors. A little bit of threads there. Okay, do one little snip on this ear. Again, this is the strong tack mat, but I have cut the same bear on the regular standard grip mat. All right, one more little spot. Give it a little snip. Okay. So now, don't want to warp this too much, although this is all going to get sewn in to the seam. This is also kind of a cheaper fabric, and so it's fraying a little bit more than I'm used to, but it'll be fine.
Kelly, how do you know when it's time to change out a blade?
So to know when to change out a blade, it's basically when your cuts are not doing as well as they used to. So you can kind of extend the life of a blade sometimes by, if you're used to being able to cut a certain material at certain settings, and then those settings no longer work as well, you can usually either add a second pass on cutting or increase your force a little bit. Sometimes you might even need to go up another blade depth. So you can fool it for a little while and get a little bit more life out of it. But basically, when your cut settings aren't working anymore, that's when it's time to change a blade. And I will usually get 4 to 6 months out of an auto blade. So they last pretty long, unless you're cutting like a lot of heavier materials like chipboard. If you're making, like I made a bunch of photo props and went through one blade just by cutting out, I can't even remember how many photo props, but a lot. And so that was a little rougher on the blade and I had to replace it sooner. Does that answer that question? Okay, so I'm going to move this mat out of the way. And set these aside for a minute. We're going to cut all of our pieces before we start to assemble. Okay, let me go back to sharing my screen. All right, so we are in the design tab, or we're in the send tab. We're going to go back to the design tab, and we can move these bears that we've cut off to the side. If you're, oh, I can't remember what I was going to say. It wasn't important. So this time I'm going to change. I'm just going to use the same window where I've got all this open up. If you move your designs off to the side, they're not going to cut. So all I'm focused on is what is on my cutting mat. So I'm going to change my page setup. So I want to keep the Cameo Pro as my machine. The cutting mat this time, I don't know if you know this, but you can use smaller cutting mats in your Cameo Pro. So I'm going to switch to the 12-inch Cameo cutting mat. And my media size has automatically resized, but I'm going to be cutting felt. And my felt pieces are 9 inches wide by 12 inches tall. So I'm just going to change that in my width and height, my width and height in my media size. And this time I'm going to be cutting the scarf. So here I can drag these main scarf pieces over. We're going to have to do this in 2 pieces. This design, for whatever reason, did not fill this part of the scarf with color, which isn't a problem for us, but if you do want to change it, you can just select it and hold your Control or your Command button on your keyboard and click on the color that you want. And that'll just copy the color over. Okay, so now we want to make sure that these fit on the size of media that I've got. So I'm going to rotate this. If you hold your Shift key, it'll snap to a 90-degree angle as it approaches that. And let's see, move this one, and I'm just going to rotate this one a little bit too to make sure that they all fit on there. Okay, so that looks pretty good. I'm going to go over to my Send tab. And again, we're going to use carriage 2. And these lines are still red, thinking that they're going to cut with carriage 1. So I'm going to select these and choose rotary cut over here, and those lines should turn blue and get these smart cut lines going there. So we're going to change the material to felt acrylic. Okay, and I also just use the defaults for that. So this is ready. I just need to get it loaded and loaded on my mat, and then I can click send again. Okay, so I've got my 12-inch mat. And I've got some felt. Make sure my label is off. I'm just going to place it in the same spot that it was on my virtual mat. So just line it up with the left edge. And you would want to pay attention. Sometimes felt is a little bit not exact. So if it says it's 9 by 12, it might not actually be 9 by 12. So just make sure that it does cover that area that you're going to be slicing through. So again, when I'm cutting felt, I like to use a brayer of some kind to roll it on. Make sure it gets pressed on there really well. And this time I'm going to adjust the rollers because I'm going to use the 12-inch mat. So I'm not sure if you can see this, but there's a little lever on the right-hand side of your machine that you need to press down. And then you're going to slide these little roller adjustments. There's also some smaller little spring coils that'll hold your media in place. So I'm just going to line this center point of the adjustment, the roller adjustment, so it's lined up with one of these arrows. And I'll just hold my mat there to kind of see, make sure I'm getting the right one. Okay, so I'm going to line up the center of this with this arrow and then lock my roller back in place. Now on the Cameo Pro, when you are using any mat smaller than the 24-inch mat, you're going to use the inner load line. So I want the left edge lined up. Oh, let's see. Okay, so I'll hit load. And I'm just gonna, it doesn't look like that grabbed it very well on this side. So let me unload that, make sure my roller is nice and clamped down. Okay, that feels secure this time. So I'm going to, my rotary blade's in there, so I'm just gonna click send and we'll watch that cut with the rotary blade. Okay, so that messed up. There's a pause button. I don't know if you can see that, but on the right-hand panel, there's a pause button. And so I hit pause and it stopped the cut. And now to cancel the cut, I'm just going to press and hold the pause button and give it, I don't know, maybe 10 seconds, and that'll stop flashing. So you know that the job is canceled, and I'll just hit unload. All right, so that for some reason was not loaded correctly. I'm going to try one more piece of felt. try and come over to the front. All right, so that is not gripping tightly as I want. All right, so what I'm going to do is go ahead and cut this on my larger mat. Actually, I need to leave, it'll tell you if you try and send it, but whenever you're cutting media that's smaller than your full 24-inch width, then you need to only stick it to the adhesive part. So there is a 1/2 inch on the side, on each side that doesn't have adhesive. So you need to place your media a 1/2 inch in. All right, I've adjusted my rollers back out. It's the outer load line. And I will come around to the front again. When I'm loading this, I kind of like to hold it up so I can give it pressure from behind. And you can use the auto load, or if you have it in place, press the load button. All right, so let me change this a little bit. All right, I need to go back to my design tab and make sure I've got the right setup. So I've got my Cameo Pro as the machine. I need to set it to Cameo Pro cutting mat. And then my 9 by 12 inch is still accurate for the width and height. And then I just need to make sure that those didn't move. You can see that little 1/2 inch here. That's represented the part you need to leave blank as you're loading your media. So I've got that loaded correctly. I'll go to the Send tab and check all my other settings. And since I canceled the job, I need to go down here and click this little X so it starts fresh. So I'll click that, give it a second to think, and make sure it doesn't say resume anymore. And now when I press send, it'll start the job from scratch. It'll start it from the beginning. That's what I want. And a little pop-up comes up to tell me to make sure to align the media on the cutting mat, which I showed you. You leave that left edge empty, that 1/2 inch, and just click through, and now it will send. we have any questions? All right, no questions. That's okay. It's fun watching machine cut. So once this is done, we'll have to also cut the tassels. How are we on time? I might just not cut those tassels.
All right, Kelly, we have a question. Somebody asked, what are the little curvy blue lines that showed on your screen that weren't part of the fabric?
Yeah, so those little blue lines show up when you are using something like the rotary blade or the craft blade. And those are called, well, the whole process is called smart cut. And those little lines are called hooks and loops. And those are little extra cuts that your rotary blade will cut in a part that's not your design. And so it can reorient the blade because it can't turn sharp corners. So it just needs to be able to kind of do a little curve motion to get that blade where it belongs. Okay, so we've got the scarf. I think we're gonna skip a little bit and pretend I cut the tassels. I'll still be able to show you this. Next thing we need to do is cut the heat transfer. Okay, so back to Silhouette Studio. We're gonna move these guys off because that's done. We'll go ahead and keep using the large mat. I wanna cut this face, and with heat transfer, with this type of heat transfer, we need to mirror it. Now, it probably wouldn't matter on this because you just put it on the side of the pillow that works. But we'll go ahead and mirror it because that's what you normally should do with heat transfer. So if you just right click, you can choose flip horizontally. And you don't see much difference, but it is now mirrored. And I'm going to set I've already cut my piece of heat transfer to 8.5 inches by 4.5 inches. I'll zoom out a little bit so you can see this. And I'm just going to center that on my page size that I just put in there. So now I can go to, basically you're just setting your page size to whatever media you're cutting. And since I've got my media trimmed down to 8.5 by 4.5, that's what I've put in. Okay, so this time we're not going to use carriage 2. We're going to use the auto blade. And so I'm going to go back up to expose the settings for carriage 1. And you see these lines are bold red, and that's what we want. We know it's cutting with carriage 1. If for some reason you had chosen it to cut with carriage 2, you would just go here in your carriage 1 section and choose cut. So we need to change the material. And we're going to go with heat transfer fabric. I missed it. There we go, heat transfer fabric. And if you were using smooth heat transfer, you would choose the correct material, whatever you're using. Now I did play with this and I don't like the defaults on this. And so for fabric heat transfer, I'm using a blade on 3. So I'll just click here down where my blade numbers are showing. Just click to the right and you'll see that the 3 is now highlighted. My force, I'm going to put at 25. My speed, I'll speed it up a little bit to 5. And I like 2 passes. It's got a fabric texture and it really likes to be cut on a second pass. And since it's small, that'll work well. Okay, so that's going to cut with my auto blade. So I just need to get that mat loaded and then I'll be able to send that. Now, when you've got felt on your mat, you can just take a lint roller and you can get most of that off. I have got my heat transfer that I've already cut. I'm loading this, I'm putting it on here upside down just because it's easier with this huge mat if I've got it close to me. So I'll leave that same 1/2 inch on the edge. Make sure that still sticks even with that felt there. This is the strong tack mat, so it's still got plenty of adhesive to hold that. Come around again. Have my lovely assistant with longer arms. Okay, that looks like it loaded right, so I'll just click send.
All right, Kelly, we have a few questions. Somebody wants to know, should you wash the fabric before you use it?
The question is, do you wash the fabric? For this project, I don't. It's just a pillow, mostly decorative. I should probably say I don't work with a lot of fabric. I don't sew very much, so you can see what a beginner does with with fabric. I pick the easiest project.
And then somebody else was wondering, obviously, like felt left some marks and shapes on your mat. How do you deal with that? Do you clean it off in any way, or?
Yeah, so I will use a lint roller on this. Those settings were a little heavy. I think I used when I was testing my settings, I probably didn't have a brand new blade, and now I'm using a brand new blade. So those settings I gave you for fabric heat transfer, you may want to lighten up a little bit. That cut through the backing. Which is fine because I've got a mat under it. But I do want it to stay in place. All right, we may be just positioning this guy's face by hand. Okay, so with heat transfer, just peel away the parts you don't need. It's got a backing on there that'll hold it in place. Here we go, now I'm on camera. I can never do this when I'm being filmed. Cut off a little bit. Just want to separate the heat transfer from its backing. There we go. And we'll try and leave the rest of the pieces in place. Right, we are done with machine, so I can move that. Okay, I don't think this will be a problem because I can still position the nose where it needs to be. Okay, so in the interest of time, I think we're going to skip the sewing part, but basically you're just going to make sure that you've got your right sides together with your fabric. And on this design, I could see that there's kind of this curve on this, kind of a curve on this bear and this side straight. So I know I can match them up this way. And so I would pin it or clip it. And with my sewing machine, what you're going to do is you're going to leave an opening at the bottom. So you would just start, and since we enlarged that design, we created that offset of 1/4 inch. We're just going to use a 1/4 inch seam allowance as we sew it. So I'm going to skip the sewing. But you can see that I've got one that I already sewed. And so I've got this opening at the bottom, and then everything else is stitched with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And so what I need to do now before I turn him inside out and apply the face, is just make sure that where you've got corners that you snip your corners, any rounded parts. Don't cut through your thread. And those of you who sew, don't laugh at me. Okay, so now we're ready to turn this guy right side out. And it's a pillow, so it's pretty hard to mess up. Good for people like me. And get those ears poked through. Just make sure all those corners and rounded bits are where they should be. Okay, and I actually wrote, which one was the front before I stitched this up. I think when I first cut it on this one, I just wrote it in pencil because that's going to be stitched in anyways. So this is the front, and now we need to get this bear's face on. And I had some problems, but you could hand place these and you would be fine. We'll get them to look close enough. Okay, and his nose went there. All right, so I'm just going to iron this. I've got a hot iron with no steam, and I'll just put a piece of fabric there. Just giving it pressure as much as I can. And this is probably not a pillow that's going to be washed a lot, so I'm not worried about getting this perfectly pressed. All right, we'll see if that worked. I want the backing to come away, and I want the heat transfer to stay there against the fabric. Looks like it might need a little bit longer. Yeah, it kind of wants to pull away a little bit, so I will iron it some more. We're trying to trigger that adhesive, get it hot enough for the adhesive that's on the back of the heat transfer to be activated and stay on the fabric. And this might be one of those that needs a cool peel, so I might need to let it cool besides ironing it. All right, so let's we'll talk about stuffing this guy and applying the putting the scarf on. So here is the finished pillow. Once you have that heat transfer on, then you're okay to go ahead and stuff him. So I'm just using a polyester stuffing. I found this bag at Joann's and it's 12 ounces and that's just about right for this bear. So basically you're just going to stuff it, not super tight, but whatever you like. And make sure you fill in the ears and you're going to stuff him down to the bottom. And then you'll just hand stitch this with white thread. Let's see if this is ready to come off. Yeah, so it looks like this fabric heat transfer wants to do a cool peel, which basically means after you've ironed it on, you let it cool for a minute, cool for a few minutes, and then the backing comes off better. Trying to get these little bits off. Okay, so we're gonna, I think, unless somebody really wants me to, I think I'm gonna skip the stuffing because you can all probably know how to stuff a bear, stuff a pillow. So this one is stuffed and I've stitched the bottom. And then with the scarf, I just took the scarf and just kind of laid it on there and I just went by what it looked like on my example for the design. When you open the design, you see what it looks like. And in your library, you can see what it looks like if you've already moved the design around a lot. But I just kind of stuck one in front and one behind. And then I took some red thread and I just hand stitched the rest of it. So I stitched on the little tassels. I stitched along the top just so it wouldn't come off. And then at the end, I just hand stitched right here on the side. And really, if you wanted to, you could hand cut another piece of felt if that bothered you that it's one-sided. But just using the design as is, I just hand stitched it in place so it would just look cute sitting on a cushion. But I think that is about it, unless we have any other questions. And I apologize for the little bits of technical difficulty. Okay, I think that we are good. So thank you for joining me. And if you do have questions, you can always reach out to me or comment on. You'll find my posts on the Silhouette blog, and I'm also on findingtimetocreate.com. And on Instagram, I'm at craftingkelly with a K. But thank you for joining me, and I hope that you make this or something like it, and I hope you've learned more about the Cameo Pro. So thank you very much.